So just how much money is poured into NATO? The answer, as we can see here, is more than half of the planet's defence spending. That's more than $1 trillion a year. NATO expenditure dwarfs that of the powers most often portrayed as potential threats. Washington's not content, though, and is in fact urging its European allies to spend much more on their militaries. Sreeram Chaulia from the Jindal School of International Affairs says that Washington is using Ukraine to justify demanding greater cash.
The Americans want the Europeans to foot more of the bill, and they're trying to feed the Europeans, the Western Europeans and the Central Europeans, with the fear of Russia in order to goad them and push them into spending more on the military and taking more of the burden sharing of NATO. But the reality is that since the Cold War has ended 25 years ago, it's impossible to try and scare the Europeans to the point where they'll all fall in line as per the American wills and ways. NATO is inherently an expansionist and imperialist military alliance that is dominated by American interests, which is meant to be imposed on Europe. So I don't think the Russian bogey, they have been using it. If you go back, today is the 65th anniversary of NATO. If you go back in time, NATO has always been based on justification of a fear and a phobia of Russia. But I think if you go even 1949 when it was created through a Red Scare, which was artificially whipped up in the West in order to make communists seem like evil people. So I think today also they're trying to resort to the same tactics. The motivation is not so much about protecting Eastern Europe from Russia or any other predator, but rather NATO itself is a predator and an imperialistic force that tries to expand, to occupy, and in some cases destabilize and destroy nation states like Libya. So what they're trying to do now after the Crimean incident is to try and justify remilitarization of Europe on a massive scale, from land, from air, as well as through nuclear weapons, in order to try and consolidate their control over Europe from the point of view of the Americans. And the Europeans must not fall for this bait, because we very well know that the Europeans cannot do without Russia, and they must continue to have equidistant relations between Russia and America for their own best interests. The events in Ukraine are going to be used by NATO in order to demand more allocations for defense and for military expenditure in all the member countries. And they will also be used as a pretext for saying that the Russians are modernizing and they've got a sleek and lean military force now, and it's a major threat, and therefore we need to also build up more conventional weaponry as well as nuclear weapons along the borders with Russia. So these are going to be used as pretexts for increasing the power of the military-industrial complex of the United States on the continent of Europe. There have been remarks about how American forces and military bases in Germany had been downsized, and now the need is to come back to the old levels, which is the Cold War levels, and that the threat is back. So I think they're going to use this now, the whole new Cold War rhetoric and the containment logic of Russia, in order to increase American control over Europe. And as I said before, I hope that Europeans do not fall for the bait, because their security lies in having harmonious relations with Russia. I think the Russians need to engage very strongly with Germany, which is a sensible European power, which is actually the leader of the European Union. And Germany is not at all inclined to towards militaristic posturing and expansionism of NATO. And Germany should be the central linchpin of the Russian strategy. And already the Germans are ambivalent about all the bellicose rhetoric that's coming from some of the other European countries as well as the United States about the situation in Ukraine. And Germany realizes that in the long run, the reality of geography, of contiguity, of history, all of these call for a more less emotional and a more rational approach towards Russia. And Russia must also emphasize the same by offering a hand of friendship to Germany and to all other sensible European countries that do not want to get again caught between a so-called West versus East logic that the Americans and the right wing in the US is pushing. I think NATO has outlived its purpose, and it is being now used increasingly, as I call it, a force multiplier for the last embers of American imperialism. NATO should not be serving these hawkish ends. Rather, it should be quietly dissolved or reordered. I mean, you have an Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. They should be in charge of keeping peace and security on the continent. Why do you need so many military bases of the Americans on the European continent? I think it's increasingly important that the Americans withdraw and rebuild at home after their huge financial crisis, which they have not yet emerged from, rather than to tax the American citizens and European citizens, to ask them to bear more and more defense spending, which is totally unnecessary. The reading of Russia as an offensive force, which is going to try and gobble up more and more territories, is totally contrary to the reality. So the American publics and the Western European publics need to be enlightened about the fact that they are being taken for a ride, using the pretext of Ukraine and Crimea to pay up more and more in order to fatten the pockets of generals and defense establishments and defense contractors who are now salivating at the possibility of eastward expansion of NATO.